J.R.R. Tolkien was a lover of words. He once compared the discovery of a volume of Finnish grammar to finding, quote, bottles of an amazing wine of a kind and flavour never tasted before. The beauty of language is arguably one of the most central facets to his works, and it should be remembered that the Elven languages were not created by Tolkien to populate Middle-earth, but instead his fictional world began with and grew around them. Nothing was more important to Tolkien's aesthetic sensibility than names. C.S. Lewis, when reviewing The Lord of the Rings, wrote that the names alone are a feast, while the, quote, piercing high elvish beauty of Galadriel and Lothlorien eclipse what any conlanger has since achieved. Tolkien also borrowed hugely from real-world languages and literature. For instance, the names of the dwarves in The Hobbit, and even the name Gandalf, are taken from Völuspá, which is a part of the Poetic Edda. The same is true of the Rohirrim, for whom, in the books, the stand-in of Old English is used to represent their language, just as modern English is used to represent the common tongue. Old English given names and name elements are used by Tolkien alongside Old English nouns to create the Anglo-Saxon aesthetic of the Rohirrim. Eomer, for instance, is not an attested real-world name, but is instead derived from eoch, which is a poetic word for horse, and as it happens the name of one of the Anglo-Saxon runes, and mare, meaning famous, which gives us something like famed horseman as a meaning for his name, or perhaps more literally horse fame. Old Germanic names are very commonly made up of two noun elements that may even mean the same thing, but have a kind of poetic feel to them that's very distinct. For instance, the Old Norse name Gunhildr for a woman means battle, battle. Eomer's uncle, Théoden King, represents Tolkien's idea of good kingship, and the name that he was given bears this out. The Old English word Théoden means prince or lord or chieftain, and this word shares its origin with Theod, which means people, tribe and nation. At an earlier stage of the language, this word was given an affix that meant leader of, to give us the ancestor of the word Theoden, Theodonos. These were descended from the Proto-Germanic Theodor, itself from Proto-Indo-European Teotech, although some scholars think that given that clear cognates to this word can only be found in Balto-Slavic and Italo-Celtic languages, perhaps a pre-Indo-European substrate origin is more likely. So the word might ultimately be derived from a language that existed in Europe prior to the Indo-European migrations. This is an interesting topic in itself and deserves more lengthy discussion outside of the scopes of this video, but it does remind us of the limits of linguistic reconstruction. The asterisks are there for a reason. We can only reconstruct back so far with reasonable certainty. The Rohirrim name themselves Eotheod, horse people, and cognates of Theod have ended up in the ethnonyms of various groups. Deutsch ultimately comes from Theodiskas, mirroring a very common cross-linguistic tendency for a group's internal name for itself to mean something like the people or the race. Even the exonyms for Germanic people, Teutons or Teutonic, these kinds of words are thought to be a Latinization of the same word, Theodiskas. Interestingly, the modern Italian word for German people is Tedesco, which very recognisably comes from Theodiskas. Relatives of this word crop up in some interesting places as well. For instance, the name of the Celtic god Tutatis, whose name would suggest him to be a kind of tribal patron or progenitor, like the Saxon Saxnert. I think it's noteworthy that Tolkien chose this word to name the king of Rohan. In a traditional worldview, the king was meant to embody the land and folk in one man, and Tolkien made this link between a king and his people explicit in the name he chose. To me, it's just another testament of his utter attention to detail and his love for words. In his works there is nothing incidental, especially not names, and this is what makes them such a feast, as Lewis said. Weist du hal, Théoden Kuning.